On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, Americans go to the polls with control of the U.S. Congress at stake. What could results mean for the world?
Keep America great.
And big American companies do show up in piles at the CIIE. An insider puts his finger on the pulse of U.S. businesses in China. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. American voters go to the polls today, a referendum of sorts on the Trump administration. The ballots will determine whether the rest of Trump's presidency will be checked by a bluer Congress or if Republican Party keeps control of both chambers. A number of important state and local seats are also at stake, including governors of 35 states. The midterms are widely seen as a vote on the U.S. president's first 2 years in office. On the eve of the elections, Mr. Trump did the rounds in 3 Midwestern states to rally for Republican candidates.
I mean, who ever even heard of midterms? I don't even know what it is. I've had a lot of people say, I don't know what midterm is, but now I'm watching every single minute, and I'm going out to vote. But the key is you have to go out to vote. Because, in a sense, I am on the ticket. You got to go out to vote.
Oh, he wants people to vote. Republicans currently hold majorities in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. With their backing, Mr. Trump has delivered on his campaign promises of imposing tariffs, cutting taxes, and appointing conservative Supreme Court justices. If the Democrats wrest control of one or both chambers, though, they could stymie or even reverse Mr. Trump's policy. The U.S. president could face renewed pressure from the probe into his ties with Russia and be forced to disclose his tax returns. Former President Barack Obama from the Democrat Party has been rallying for Democratic candidates around the country, and he called the elections a test of the country's character. According to reports, this year's early voter turnout is set to hit a historical high. As the political division in America deepens, the turnout for both Democrats and Republicans is surging.
Because I don't want my taxes to go up, I don't want Georgia to become socialist, and I also don't want any messing around with the Second Amendment.
Well, I think this election is very important. I think it's important that we establish some kind of restraint on the current president, and the only way to do that it would be to make sure we get at least the House in the Democratic hands.
Another issue in this election, I think, is the problem of immigration, and I think we need to build a wall and stop that.
We're going to have another wave of women coming into office. We think it's really, really important, especially when we're appointing people like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh to our Supreme Court. We are motivated to change this.
The U.S. midterm election. For more about that, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Rong Ying, the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Also, we are joined by 2 other guests from the United States on the phone. I want to start with you, Mr. Rong, about that. What is China watching this midterm election about? What are some of the biggest issues you are very much interested in? Briefly.
I think for China, for the Chinese audience, certainly I think United States is such a big country, such a country that looms large for China's foreign policy and the issue that China cares. We certainly followed, watched very closely. But the interesting thing is that for Chinese and the world outside the United States, usually we used to watch the presidential election, stay up all night wanting to know the results. For midterm elections, seems that they are more local, and they are not very much, I think, kind of concerned.
Right, but this year it's going to be very different. Why is it different, and what are the issues you're looking at specifically?
Of course, looking at the change or the possible change of the structure in terms of which party, the Democrats or the Republicans, are going to take over the House or the Senate, because that would change the balance of power and putting pressure on the executives, which is Trump's president, and have implications for the policy.
Well, now there's a lot of things going on right now between China and the United States. For example, whether the quote-unquote trade war, and also whether the other aspect of the bilateral relations is going to getting better or worse, and there's likely to be a meeting between the two presidents coming G20. So if there is a change of the midterm in terms of who will hold which house, the Senate or the House of Representatives, what would that mean for China?
I think for China, of course, if Republicans remains the control of the two chamber, which means that the Trump administration will be able to continue to pursue its agenda, both domestically and on the foreign front.
Right.
And the implication is that the trade disputes, the policy, Trump administration has been pursued regarding its trade disputes with China would continue. And that, of course, would have implications for China. As we know that it has been already announced Mr. Yang Jiechi, the highest sort of ranking diplomat in charge of diplomacy, is leading a delegation for diplomatic security talks with the United States, meeting the counterpart, and also
coming Friday.
That's right. It's expected that it will prepare the ground for the meeting, and that would also give an that would be happen in the context and the backdrop.
But Mr. Rong, let's just get the picture clear here. If the Democrats is taking one of those chambers, would that mean a real change when it comes to the approach of U.S.-China direction? Whether a party difference really make that much directional difference between China and the United States?
Well, I don't see that a direct sort of implication for that in terms of change. But rather in broader sense, I think if you look at the overall policy of the two parties, both the Democrats and Republicans, it seems that they don't have a big difference in how to deal with China, which is more confrontational, and it would be more difficult, at the time.
So if the Democrats taking one of the chambers, does it make much difference at all?
I think there are a lot of speculations. If you look at the agenda of the Democrats in the past, history would tell that Democrats also have its problem, also have the agenda to pursue, even on the trade. So one school of speculation that there might be a sort of competition for which party is tougher with China. But the other implication I have to point out is that if Democrat takes control the House, as a lot of people are speculating, then President Trump may be under pressure to think about changing some of approach tactically to deal with its foreign policy. Here, I think it may have implications for its way dealing with China.
Whether for better or worse, we don't know.
We don't know.
At this point, even though there could be some change over there at the two chambers. Let me have on the phone Bruce Fein, who is the lawyer and also former Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan. Mr. Fein, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful, sir. What is your assessment of the turnout so far? What would that mean for the real battle for hours to take place before we see the result?
Well, a couple of observations. First, it's rather risky for the president to put his presidency on the line based on the outcome of the congressional elections midterm. There are two prior examples. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson basically went to the American people and said, if you support my war policies in World War I, you need to vote all Democrats in. And there was a huge shellacking and President Wilson lost his stature. He lost the League of Nations. As you well know, among other things, he acquiesced in Japanese acquisition and control over Shandong province, a disavowal of his own 14 points. Then Franklin Roosevelt in 1938 went to the American people and said, you need to vote in these Democrats, we need to change the Supreme Court, and he also had a shellacking. So one of the riskiest things with Mr. Trump is because he's made it clear in his campaigns for Republican candidates that if he loses, he's going to have lost his mandate. It will severely undercut his ability to influence Congress and get his way because the American people would have sent a message, no, we are not supporting your policies. Now, on the specifics, if the Democrats win control of the House or the Senate, I think that's going to very much expose the weaknesses of the Trump administration. Yeah. They clearly will have the important power of oversight to obtain through subpoenas access not only to his past tax returns, but information regarding surveillance, regarding what they want to obtain concerning communications with the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, why he was firing Mr. Comey. It means all those kinds of things which could really hamstring his ability to do much in the next 2 years.
But Mr. Fain, we all know that the midterm election really is more or less a referendum about the president's work over the past 2 years. It's always been like that. Particularly now you have a president that is at least charismatic, if you agree with me about that adjective. So Mr. Fain, of course, you see a very big giant figure or elephant in the room, Mr. Donald Trump.
Well, that's where he is now. We'll find out after the balloting today and the counting whether or not he's, during his 2 years, he's received the support of the American people, because you rightly say he could be very strengthened if the Republicans win. But if he loses, he'll go from an elephant into a mouse. It'll look like a paper tiger. And that happens in politics. You can go from the peaks to the valleys very quickly, and that's what makes this particular election very risky for Mr. Trump. He's made claims that China and Russia and other countries are colluding, interfering with the elections, all these things that I think are very, very dubious, and the Democrats will expose them if they get control of Congress and get access to the proper information. So I just think until we get the outcome of the votes, we don't know whether this is going to be a home run for Mr. Trump or a strikeout.
But you know, Mr. Fain, that any one of the two parties could take advantage of the whether true or not accusations against the other parties, saying, well, you have some problems during election, and they could also accuse foreign governments of saying, oh, you interfere into our own elections. Whether that is true or not, well, the investigation would take a long time. So the question is, in this very dramatic geopolitical changing time, what would this election mean inside the United States and its interactions with the geopolitics that we have been witnessing over the past few months? Mr. Fain.
Well, my view is that our relations with China certainly would improve if the Democrats obtain ascendancy in either the House or the Senate. Mr. Trump has been very belligerent, not only in trade, but in the South China Sea, with regard to keeping so-called missile systems in South Korea, accusing the Chinese as being the next boogeyman like Russia in interfering with U.S. elections. We indicted Chinese alleged hackers for various and sundry things. He's clearly escalating. And not only that, he's trying to have more military training exercises in the Philippines. Basically, he's trying to encircle China, if you will. That is something I do not think the Democrats will believe is a sensible program whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense for us to challenge China's sphere of influence when we have our own that we've kept for 200 years in the Caribbean and Latin America with the Monroe Doctrine. So I think it'll tone down and increase the likelihood that we will be able to avoid a trade war that does neither good for either party. if the Democrats take control. On the other hand, if the Republicans keep control, I think it's very troublesome. We are looking at a further escalation. And I don't know where that leads, but it's not going to be positive for either China or the United States.
Mr. Rong, here in the Beijing studio, earlier we have several discussions about what this midterm election is going to be about. Is it about the economy? Is it about geopolitics? Many of us agree it's going to be about jobs. It's also going to be Donald Trump. In a way, he set himself over there as a big campaign issue. Mr. Rong, what do you make of the political divisions that the U.S. has witnessed over the past few years, from the election of Donald Trump until today, which is the day of the midterm election?
Yeah, I think the political division or the partisanship has been there for quite a long time. And I don't know, I mean, whatever result would come out from this midterm election will change. But it is true that if the sort of balance of power between, I mean, if the Republicans maintain the two houses, then I think President Trump would be sort of balanced, and in the sense that is the Trumpism that would be there to stay. Otherwise, I think, for me, I think there are a lot of question marks, and to go how far. I mean, how much changes? Definitely, there have to be changes with the, Trump administration.
Okay, Mr. Feng, as you may know, the political division inside your country, the rhetorics going on over the past few years, the president's gestures when there are crucial issues such as guns, shooting incidents, such as the issue of how to deal with Israel, many other things. It seems that it's creating ever more different opinions inside the country. It's very interesting to watch a country going to the polls when the political division is getting ever bigger and deeper. Mr. Feng, is this midterm election going to be different from your perspective?
I think it's different in the sense that for what you've described, the intensity level has risen so that we will get a very high turnout. To that extent, that's good. We want citizens to participate in politics in a peaceful way, and that's how you resolve them at the ballot box. I don't know whether or not simply participation means that we're becoming more unified as a country. But I will say that one of the troublesome things, despite all of the rancor between the two parties on some issues, is that there is very little debate, in my judgment, wrongfully, about our projection of military force everywhere around the country, running 9 wars never declared by the Congress of the United States, permitting the president to undo treaties on his own, make treaties on his own without Senate confirmation. And if you look at the long term, and despite what some believe is Mr. Trump's successes in his first 2 years, you remember we've got $1 trillion deficit in the budget. We have a national debt that's now approaching $25, $26 trillion. We're just paying the interest on the debt. It's running to close to $1 billion a year. We cannot continue down that path. And no one wants to actually confront these larger institutional issues that, in my judgment, are diminishing our ability to compete on a world stage.
Well, Mr. Feng, you might consider so, but will most of voters going to the polls really thinking about the issues that you just mentioned? It's a big question mark on that. I would like to also invite to our conversation Joel Rubin, who is the president of the Washington Strategy Group. Mr. Rubin, what a pleasure to have you also on the phone early hour in your time. Going to the polls today?
Well, it's great to be with you, and yes, and I've actually been working the polls today in my district, and was out canvassing all day yesterday. What we canvassing is knocking on doors, door to door, asking people to go out and vote for certain candidates. So it's been a really exciting election period. A lot of energy and enthusiasm. A lot of looks from voters. Of course, I'm voting this year. So we may have an historic turnout for a midterm election this cycle, which I think would have a big impact on Democratic candidates in particular in terms of getting them into Congress next year.
But when you look at the Congress and also the Democratic Party, Mr. Rubin, of course, you've been an ardent supporter of the party over the years. You even served in some of the Democratic administration. But having said that, though, it seems that the Democrats, despite of the controversy President Trump and the Republican Party has been creating over the years, has not necessarily standing out, in some people's words, in this election. And also, it seems to be not necessarily going to have a definite answer whether it's going to have at least one of the chambers.
Well, this is a really complicated election year, and historically, the party out of power, in this case would be the Democrats, would pick up seats in the midterm. Usually that's how American elections go, but this year, and then Democrats also for a significant amount of time had a lot of energy amongst their base voters. But President Trump has done something which is a little abnormal, but I guess we should expect from him, which is to really make it about him, this election, even though he's not on the ballot. And he's been very active in rallying his voters in key districts and states and trying to turn out Republicans. And that is unique because oftentimes presidents try to avoid appearing to be on the losing end because of those historic trends. He's fighting to keep his party in power. And, you know, he does have a strong economy behind him. He is able to demonstrate that he has lived up to what he promised to his base voters. So we'll see if he's able to, in these closing days, have turned on enough Republican voters to maintain the Senate and hold back some of the losses in the House.
Right. Mr. Rubin, I mean, on the one hand, you see the China-U.S. thing going on. On the other hand, you also see the Trump administration has been making apparently some choices when it comes to the U.S. relations with the rest of the world, about unilateralism, about so-called withdrawal from some of the international treaties. If the two parties are dividing the two chambers, will things be different?
Well, what would end up happening if it's divided Congress is that the president paradoxically would have more independence and authority to execute his foreign policy regarding China and face very much a free rein to do that. But if the Democrats are very concerned about his positions on China, they can use the chamber in the House, if they take the House, to really make noise about it and criticize the president and create a lot of complicated votes for him. And that's something he hasn't experienced yet. And I don't think he really understands, quite frankly, about what it will be like to have the opposition party doing oversight, doing hearings, engaging in subpoenas to really put pressure on him. But he would have his own independent authority different from the last few years.
Thank you so much. Your insights are Joe Rubin, Bruce Fein, and also Ron Ying.